Hello, everyone. Hello. I'm just going to give everyone a moment to join. So we'll probably start in 1 or 2 minutes. So we'll just let people in. Uh, but hello, thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, as I say, we'll just give it a moment for people to come in and join. And we'll start at, let's say, 3 past 3. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Give it just a moment. Great. I see loads of people coming in. That's fantastic. Um, Cool. We'll just give it 1 more minute and then we'll get going. Cool. In the meantime, I'll try and share my screen. Great. Hopefully people can see that. Okay. Great. We'll just give it 1 more minute and then we'll get going. But yeah, thanks everyone for being so prompt. That's fantastic. Uh, Great. Okay, well let's get started. I can see about 30 people in the room, so that seems like a good number of people. I should say I'm recording this session, um, so that if anyone misses it, they can have a recording. If you know anyone who wanted to be here but can't make it, feel free to just email me afterwards and I can send the recording. I will stop the recording when we do the Q&A at the end, so you can feel free to sort of ask questions in confidence. That said, you can also, there should be a Q&A function in the chat or a chat, so feel free to sort of put questions throughout. I'll probably just do questions at the end, but if you say something throughout that comes up, I can keep an eye on that and see if it's sort of relevant to what I'm talking about. Yeah, with that said, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you being here. My name's Ed. I was one of the co-authors on our report, which came out last week, called After Choosing Sides. The reason we chose to do this report was we have been studying attitudes to the Israel-Palestine conflict right since sort of almost immediately after October 7th in 2023. And we've been looking at attitudes and how they've been changing in the time since then. In November 2023, we did a very detailed report. We sort of did a series of focus groups around the country, a series of polls looking at what people felt and why they felt it. The story at the time was that most people were sort of shocked and horrified by what was going on, but there were really big gaps between those who were sort of the minority who were very engaged in the conflict and the bigger group of people who were, I would say, more disengaged and didn't have such strong views. In the time since, there's been some really high-profile cases of where the conflict in Gaza has sort of really shaped social dynamics in the UK. So we had, for example, in the elections last year, a number of Muslim candidates running on pro-Gaza independent tickets, basically, and sort of doing very well in areas with large Muslims populations. We've also obviously had a number of very high-profile protests going on, and I was really struck actually doing this research how that has shaped views to protest in this country, which I'll talk about later. We've had a range of sort of, well, we've had very visibly increased both anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate. Obviously, that culminated with the attack on the synagogue in Manchester a couple of weeks ago, and that was sort of really pronounced when I was doing all the focus groups to this. So what we did basically was, this was actually a research project we've been wanting to do for a while. But as the conflict and the situation in Gaza kept changing, we kept having to rewrite the survey and start again from scratch as things were changing so differently. So the approach for this was sort of at the start of October, we decided we would just write a survey and field it and conduct, I think we did about 9 focus groups with people all around the country as quickly as we could so that the data is as fresh in people's minds as possible. And as such, most of this data comes from the second half of October, so it's really fresh. And again, the aim is not for us to sort of study what's going on in Gaza and Israel. We're really looking at how the conflict in the Middle East has shaped social dynamics in Britain over the last 2 years. So we'll go into this in more detail, so I won't spend loads of time on it. But I would say sort of the top lines from the research that we're going to see here is that still most people do not take a side in the conflict. In fact, sort of 60% of the country say they don't take a side, and that's not because they don't care. It's like many of those people really do care and are horrified by what they see on the news. But as we'll see, many of them feel uncomfortable taking sides. They don't see it as a sort of issue where you need to take a side. I think you can be appalled by what's going on without leaning towards one side or another. And actually, most importantly, those who have taken a side have become much more entrenched in their views over the last 2 years. So they think worse of the people on the other side. They're less willing to compromise on their views. They're less willing to empathize with people on the other side. And sort of that sort of polarization from very engaged people makes the majority of people who aren't so engaged much more afraid to speak up about the conflict. So that is the top lines. You'll also see that throughout this research, we've used our 7 segments. So many of you will have seen these before, but this is sort of a large segmentation we did of the British public, where we don't segment people according to their demographics. So sort of your age or your religion doesn't go into this. We also don't segment people according to views on any issues. So people aren't segmented according to their views on Gaza, for example. But we do segment people according to their sort of very upstream beliefs and worldviews. So if you know Jonathan Haidt's work on moral foundations theory, that goes into this. Carol Stenner's work on authoritarianism, it's a big part of our segmentation. And the idea is basically that we put people into groups according to how they see the world, and that allows us to better explain why they have certain views on different issues and get a really better sense of the scale of polarization on different issues. And before I move on, I should say, because people always ask, you can go to our website and you can do a quiz and find out which segment you fall into if you just search 7 segments online. When you do this in the UK, you get these 7 segments. Some of them, I guess, are more intuitive than others. So progressive activists, for example, kind of are what they say on the tin. They're the most politically engaged segment. They're the only segment really who say their political causes they care about are very important to their own identity. In many cases, they're the least willing to compromise. And actually, interestingly, they're the only segment who say they enjoy talking about politics. Every other segment say that's something they'd rather not do. As you'll see on issues relating to Gaza and Israel in particular, they can have very strong views that are often not necessarily in line with the rest of the country. The incrementalist left they hold similar sort of values to progressive activists. They want to see the gap between rich and poor going down. They want to see sort of the government caring about those who are most disadvantaged in society. They care about social justice, but they are much less politically engaged. So they don't watch the news, for example. And they are also sort of much more willing and wanting to preserve our current institutions rather than tear them all down and start again. So they have high trust in things like the BBC, for example. Established liberals, if we're thinking in like political terms, these are sort of your Cameronite Tories. They're very wealthy, or they're wealthier than other groups. They really are sort of high trust in our institutions. They're pretty socially progressive, but on the economy, they tend to be more sort of pro-free markets. But they're the most optimistic about the way things are going in the country. They're also very high information groups, so they do lots of reading about things like the conflict in Gaza, for example. Skeptical scrollers are a group who only really exist because of the pandemic. So they spend a lot of time online. They've really shifted away from mainstream media and get much more news from places like YouTube or podcasts or things like that. And unlike the other groups who are a bit older, they are more sort of nihilistic about the role that politicians can play in fixing our country's problems. Are much more likely to say that sort of like it's on individuals or that things just won't get better. Rooted patriots, you might think of them as your sort of red wall voters if you're thinking in political terms. So they are very socially conservative. They tend to live in sort of left behind places. They're quite cautious about change, and they don't want to see someone come and like overthrow things because they sort of value tradition a bit. But they are sort of your typical red wall voters. Traditional conservatives are also kind of what they say on the tin. They really value tradition and authority and personal responsibility, but they are skeptical of anything that sort of is too anti our institutions, and they want to see our institutions and traditions preserved. That makes them quite different to dissenting disruptors, the last segment, who really are sort of the radical, more right-leaning group, who really desire really quite radical and significant change. That makes them very sympathetic towards Reform UK, for example, and really sort of in desire and demand for sort of a big leader who can shake up the system. That's sort of what makes them the disruptors of it all. So those are the seven segments. Sometimes it's helpful to see them in this political view. So you'll see progressive activists used to be Jeremy Corbyn's real base in 2019. Now they have Labour has all but squandered the progressive activists. You see the Green Party is actually doing better with progressive activists than Labour is. Incrementalist left still are Labour's current strongest party, but they're also shifting slightly towards the Liberal Democrats. Established Liberals, you'll see it's a neck and neck between the Conservatives and Labour. Skeptical scroll is a graph that's slightly misleading because they're really unlikely to vote. They only have about 30% turnout. But you'll see they are sort of also sort of drifting towards reform. Then you've got rooted patriots who have voted for Conservatives, for Labour, and for reform in the past, quite significantly voting, drifting towards reform, and the same for the traditional Conservatives and dissenting disruptors. If you want to look at their attitudes to conflict, I won't go into this in too much detail now because we'll come into it in much more throughout the presentation. But you can see progressive activists are, as I said earlier, the only segment actually where a majority support one side in the conflict. In fact, much more than half of them support Palestinian side. They're extremely engaged in the conflict, and like I said earlier, they view it as central to their identity. They also use language which is quite different to how the rest of the country talk about it. So they will, for example, use words like genocide, which no other segments tend to use. And also, as we'll see, their negative views of the Israeli government, in some cases, extend towards negative views of Israeli citizens themselves. And I'll show you some graphs to emphasize that. The incrementalist left are a really interesting group because they're actually the most concerned about Israeli and Palestinian civilians, but among the least likely to have taken a side in the conflict. So they're more sympathetic to Palestine, but there's still no majority who are pro-Palestine. But they are sort of more put off by the more sort of disruptive forms of protest, for example, which might sort of make them more cautious about turning that high level of compassion and sympathy they have into a more sort of activist-y stance. Then you've got the established liberals, they're very high information, as I said earlier, so they're reading a lot about the conflict, and they're really concerned about sort of division in the UK and how it's shaping Britain. Skeptical scrollers, the thing that really defines them is that they are the most distrusting of information they've seen online. Many of them will follow sort of two or three influencers on Instagram who they really trust, but not necessarily trust the BBC, for example, to find their facts. They're actually very engaged and informed on the conflict generally, but they're quite nihilistic about sort of any possibility that it might end anytime soon. Rooted patriots, one thing that really defines them is a very high threat perception. So they're very alert to dangers around the world. And that makes them feel really sort of shocked and appalled every time they see something coming out of Gaza. It also makes them really concerned about the impacts on the UK. So they're very concerned about things like rising anti-Semitism, the increased risk of terrorism and things like that. Really sort of puts off rooted patriots. Traditional conservatives are interesting because in many ways they're the opposite of progressive activists in this conflict. So whereas progressive activists are very positive about people who go to pro-Palestine protests, traditional conservatives are really opposed to people who go to those pro-Palestine protests. The thing that makes them different is that while progressive activists are pretty negative towards Israel supporters, traditional conservatives are also quite negative towards Israel supporters. Generally speaking, they just don't like sort of very outlandish protesters. And then finally, dissenting disruptors. They're more of like, I guess, in an American sense, not a Britain first sense, but they're quite Britain first in that they sort of don't think that Britain should be involved in the conflict at all, and they're sort of confused about why there's been so much sort of time spent debating the conflict and thinking about it in Britain. So those are the segments. You can see here the chart I was alluding to earlier. Progressive activists, by far the segment most likely to sympathise with one side or another. 60% of them say they sympathise with the Palestinian side. Traditional conservatives, a third of them support Israel, but it's still nowhere near a majority. But you'll see the biggest group in almost every segment are these grey groups in the middle, where people are much more likely to say they sympathise with both sides equally, with neither side, or they're not sure which side they lean towards. But we'll discuss this in much more detail in a moment. Okay, so here's the top line. And I think this is, I mean, in many ways, this is the most surprising element from the report. This conflict has been really in the news for 2 years, and then you would expect over that time that attitudes would have changed quite significantly. And certainly, sort of, if you read about growing protest movements, for example, you'd expect more people to have taken a side by now. But that's not really what's happened. Basically, we've had more about Slightly more people now say they sympathize with the Palestinian side, so that's gone up from 18 points to 26 points. Slightly fewer people say they sympathize with the Israeli side, it's gone down by 2 points. But really, still, the vast majority of people fall in that middle section. In the middle, we've had basically fewer people now say they sympathize with both sides equally, many more people saying they sympathize with neither side. And that neither side thing sort of came up in focus groups all the time for this. People saying, like, I hate all sides, like they're both sort of harming each other unnecessarily, or say war is war. How can you like what either of them are doing? Lots of them will say that like they feel awful for Palestinian citizens, and they also feel that the Israeli government had to respond. They also think Israel's gone too far. That most people tend to think that Israeli government's gone too far. But the big picture is that most people just do not feel like this is a conflict where they ought to be putting themselves on the side, and many people sort of feel that they don't need to do so. That said, there are some shared starting points that are basically held across the whole public, regardless of what side you put yourself on or if you put yourself on neither side. Most people are really horrified by the conflict and think that the impact on civilians is too much and is outrageous and should stop. Um, People have extreme sympathy for the citizens in Gaza, but they also think that, like, isn't it awful that people often say this focus groups is awful that they had to be governed by Hamas and there's no clear sort of opportunity for a longer peace where they have a better life in the future, even if fighting were to stop. Likewise, people sort of think that what happened on October 7th was horrible. They think that Israel sort of did need to respond in some way, generally speaking. But they think that Israel's gone far too far, and they think that sort of Israel's actions in many cases haven't been justified in doing so. Um, and then back at home, there's sort of extreme concern, particularly in the last month, about the targeting of Jews in Britain, particularly following that terrorist attack. And there's also sort of increased worry about how the conflict is shaping integration and extremism and religious cohesion in the country. That said, like I said earlier, most Britons don't take a side. And if you ask people why they don't take a side, it tends to be that people think there's good and bad on both sides, that both sides are as bad as each other, and the situation is just too complex or people don't know enough about it. If you look at this quote from Zoe in Hastings, I think it sums it up quite well. She basically says, I just feel really sad. She doesn't know why it's going on. It doesn't make sense to her. But she doesn't really know enough to say that she takes a side, or she doesn't see that like being sad about the situation necessarily leads to taking a side for her. As we've tracked the conflict, it's been interesting to see how people's real concerns about the conflict has changed over time. So back in November 2023, that's these grey dots here, people were really concerned about the impact on Palestinian and Israeli civilians, and also worried that it was going to escalate. Those concerns have fallen quite a lot. That's marked by the red dots. Now the top concerns are the risk of increased extremism in the UK and rising tensions between religious communities in the UK, and also concerns about anti-Semitism have gone up a little bit too. Basically, I think in particular because this polling was done after that attack in Manchester, people are really alert to sort of how the conflict is shaping Britain, and maybe in some cases, as that ceasefire has emerged in Israel and Gaza, thinking a little less about what's going on exactly over there. But yeah, it was really pronounced and obvious in all the focus groups that concern about the impact at home was really visible. Some people, and this isn't everyone, but some people in some of our focus groups told us that sort of the conflict had gone on so long that it was getting just exhausting to keep up to date with it all. And people saying that they've switched off from the conflict because they just don't see it coming to an end anytime soon, and that it was just basically too depressing. Someone said, I can't remember if we have the group here, but someone here was like, I wouldn't leave my house if I watched the news every day because it's just too worrying. But yeah, lots of people sort of very sort of distressed and exhausted with what's going on, basically. Something we see throughout the report is that progressive activists is kind of the outlier in some of this, and they have remained the most engaged in the conflict. So they're 3 times as likely to have signed petitions related to conflicts, twice as likely to have posted on social media about the conflict, twice as likely to have got into arguments about the conflict than the rest of the country. And if you look at some of the language from Dave and John, for example, in the bottom, you'll see that many of them are sort of using, they're much more passionate about the conflict, basically, than the other segments are. Some of you will have read our progressive activist report, that sort of groups progressive activists into different categories themselves. I think Dave really represents what we call the vocal ideologue segment, who really are sort of very vocal about these issues and really sort of outspoken and engaged on them. John, I think, represents the more we call them the non-dogmatic progressives, sort of quiet people who go along with progressives. They do care about those issues, but they don't necessarily want to be leading the charge on them. I think one stat that's really stuck out to me from the report is that progressive activists are just a tenth of the country, but they're a quarter of the people who've posted about it on social media. So you can see they're sort of definitely like overrepresented on online spaces where the conflict is discussed. Another group who do stand out is young people. So when we first did this research 2 years ago, we could say that every generation, a majority of people don't take a side. That's not true anymore. The majority of 18 to 24-year-olds say they sympathize with the Palestinian side. And if you look at the bottom, you can see that's gone from a third in 2023. Interestingly, older people, we've also had quite big changes, but from a much lower base. So the number of 65 plus year olds sympathizing with Palestine has doubled since November 23. That actually happened in the first few months of the conflict. But I guess that sort of explains why you've seen a lot of those older people going to, for example, the Palestine Action marches, being arrested, and those images sort of taking up a lot of the news. But we've noticed particularly it's younger people, students at university, have really swung in quite a dramatic way towards the Palestinian side. And I'm afraid this is quite a complex battery of graphs, but bear with me because I think it's interesting and it says a lot. If you just look at the left two graphs, you can see the majority of people, about well, half of people, say they have a negative view towards the Israeli government. And you see even more people have a negative view towards Hamas. Though that for most of the country does not extend towards negative views towards Israeli citizens or Palestinian citizens. I would say the exception is progressive activists and skeptical scrollers, where people in those two segments, again, the youngest segments, much more likely to also say they have a negative view of Israeli citizens themselves. And you do find some dissenting disruptors who say they have negative views of Palestinian citizens. But progressive activists and skeptical scrollers in particular are quite notable for saying that they have a negative views of Israelis as well. We've also asked a lot of questions about Hamas, and this is a question that has changed quite a lot in the last 2 years. So 2 years ago, every segment pretty overwhelmingly said they would describe Hamas as terrorists. That has remained the case for most segments. But if you look at progressive activists in particular, only a quarter of them now say they would describe Hamas as terrorists. We've had a big growth in progressive activists saying they don't know. But actually, you get lots of progressive activists saying Hamas are more likely to be freedom fighters or militants. But that said, having said that, for the rest of the country, and it's really clear from the qualitative research, particularly with rooted patriots who have this very high threat perception, really concerned about terrorism, actually, because of that. People really don't like Hamas, generally speaking. And we saw that on the last page where it was like 75% of the country have a negative view towards Hamas. Attitudes to Israel are interesting as well. So the majority of people in Britain will say that Israel has a right to exist. I mean, only 7% say that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. I think it's also notable that even if you look at people who sympathize more with Palestine, 2/3 of them basically say Israel has a right to exist, and there's only 20% of people on that Palestinian side who say Israel doesn't have a right to exist. And then if you ask, has Israel been proportionate in the war? Again, you get about 40% of the country saying that Israel's been disproportionate. Lots of people say they don't know. And it's really sort of mostly people on the Israeli side who are more likely to say that Israel's been completely proportionate. Although I would say it's also interesting that on the Israeli side, even people who sympathize more with Israel, only 3 in 10 say that Israel's been completely proportionate. So it's sort of in both questions I showed you just now, people willing to criticize, I guess, their own side that they're on in some ways, and an openness to slightly other views, even though obviously the numbers there are quite stark. Okay, so that's sort of attitudes to the complex, the top line, to sort of give you a basis of what people think. What the report really focuses on is how the conflict has changed attitudes in Britain towards each other and started to sort of impact on social cohesion more broadly. Here is sort of the top line chart of what's going on. So this shows basically net scores in terms of what people think of each of these different groups. So if it's a negative number, people tend to think worse of those people. And if it's a positive number, people tend to think better of those people. So if we look at, for example, in the bottom left, across every segment, quite clearly, people think worse of people who would post on social media justifying October 7th. That makes sense. If you look one to the right of that, you can see if someone posts on social media in support of Palestine, you quite quickly polarize the segments. So progressive activists think way better of someone who posts support of Palestine. Social media, traditional conservatives really don't like that. Similarly, for people who went to a pro-Palestine march, across all the segments, everyone thinks worse of someone who went to a pro-Israel march. Again, it's interesting if you look at the traditional conservatives, they think worse of people who go to marches on either side. We'll come to this in a moment later. But they are just more anti-protest in general. They don't like the disruption it causes. Every segment tends to think better of someone who posts on social media calling for the release of hostages. And it's only dissenting disruptors who would narrowly think better of someone for posting in support of Israel. I think one thing, so it's obviously quite clear gaps here, particularly between progressive activists and traditional conservatives. And as we'll see in a moment, um, that has significant impacts for basically how people can debate and discuss the conflict if they think worse of people on the opposing side. I want to draw your attention to the chart on the bottom right, which is also an interesting gap that doesn't get discussed so much, which is that every segment, bar progressive activists really, would think better of someone who doesn't post about the conflict at all. Um, and I think it's interesting that sort of for all these sort of divides between pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, whatever, it's interesting that most people who, again, are fairly disengaged would rather people just not get involved. Progressive activists are the exception there, really. Here's a really dramatic example of this. We've asked people, basically, on the left, would you stop being friend, or would you consider stop being friends with someone if they posted on social media strongly supporting Israel? And on the right, would you consider strongly supporting giving up with stop being friends with someone if they strongly supported Palestine? What's notable is that 43% of pro-Palestine people say they consider ending a friendship with someone who posts in favor of Israel. And similar numbers, 46% of pro-Israel people would do the same if their friend posted in support of Palestine. Again, this is a real challenge for cohesion and discussing the debate between both sides, because if they think worse of each other, don't want to talk to each other, don't like each other, it becomes much harder to have those discussions sort of in good faith and in a constructive way. Part of this is related to why people think their other sides, sort of people on the other side come to those views. So if you ask people who support Israel, why do they support Israel? Overwhelmingly, they say it's because they think Israel has a right to defend itself against terrorists. They see Israel as an ally of the West, and they sympathize with Jews because of historic persecution. But if you ask people on the other side why they support Israel, they say they think it's because they're anti-Muslim or anti-Arab, or they've read misinformation online, or they want to eliminate a Palestinian state entirely. The challenge here basically is that if people who sympathize more with Palestine sort of don't understand or aren't empathetic to why people come to their views on the other side or think they're coming to those views in bad faith, again, it makes discussing the conflict between the two sides really difficult if they think that the opponents sort of hold those views for bad reasons. We see actually a more dramatic going the other way. So if you ask people who sympathize with Palestine why they do that, it's because they see Palestinians as victims of occupation displacement. They think Israel's been too aggressive and they identify with Palestine as an oppressed or colonized people. If you ask people on the opposing side why they think people sympathize with Palestine, overwhelmingly they think it's because they're anti-Semitic or they don't believe in Israel's right to exist. Again, it makes it really hard to have these conversations if you're presuming that everyone on the other side, for example, doesn't believe in Israel's right to exist, which actually we know, I showed you earlier, the majority of people on the Palestinian side do believe in Israel's right to exist. So we get these really clear perception gaps that make discussion of the conflict much harder because people presume that the other side are coming to those views in bad faith. We've also had sort of very high concern about rising anti-Semitism. So you can see just after the Manchester attack in particular, for the first time in our tracking, we had more people saying that Britain was an unsafe place for Jews than it was a safe place. That's sort of gone back slightly in a few weeks, but still a real significant spike in people saying that Britain is unsafe for Jewish people. And I think it was really moving. We did a series of focus groups with young Jews for this project. And I mean, I was expecting people to talk about feelings of safety and how worried they would be sort of wearing a kippah or a Magen David in public. What was really notable was also just the fear of social backlash that they talked about. So I spoke to a number of young Jewish kids who said that they didn't want to tell their friends in school they were Jewish, for example, for fear that they might sort of stop being friends with them. So it's really sort of pronounced throughout our research. Both people are worried about this and also that Jews are sort of experiencing it in much more sort of pronounced ways at the moment. Similarly, we've had a real rise in anti-Muslim hate. I think the interesting thing here is that um, clearly this spiked with the summer riots last year, as you can see, but it's also been on the increase. Um, this is tied up in other questions that aren't related to Israel, and the link between the Israel-Gaza war is less direct than it is with anti-Semitism. So much of the rise in anti-Muslim hate and Islamophobia has obviously been caused by the increased salience of immigration, the Tommy Robinson marches that have been happening. And when we spoke to Muslims for our focus groups, it was clear that sort of the conflict in Gaza didn't help things, but they were most concerned about sort of the rise in sort of other factors. So, for example, I spoke to one carer in Essex who said that he needs to go visit people's houses, and he saw lots of people were flying George Cross now, and obviously most of those people he thought were fine, but he was now worried that when he saw a flag flying in a house, he was going to visit someone to care them. He didn't know what reaction he was going to get because he was just very alert to the fact that Britain is a less safe place for Muslims now than it was a few years ago. That rise is really pronounced. I think what's notable, though, is that concern about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia have become politically polarized. So if you look on the left, progressive activists are just more concerned about all forms of discrimination than other segments. So they're more concerned about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia from a national average. But they are more concerned about Islamophobia, and there's quite a significant sort of 17-point gap there in the difference. If you look at segments on the right of politics, they are much more concerned about anti-Semitism than they are about Islamophobia. Um, I think the challenge here is if these two concerns become a left-right issue, rather than sort of just being seen as two sort of symptoms of the same problem, if they become a left-right issue, it means that if someone is concerned about anti-Semitism, people on the left will assume that that's sort of a right-wing or reformy viewpoint. Likewise, if someone's concerned about Islamophobia, people on the right might assume it's a left-wing viewpoint, and it becomes much harder to tackle those issues if they become politically polarized in that way. So this is not sort of necessarily something we're seeing now, although there was sort of some evidence of it in the focus groups, which I can talk to. But it's really notable as a trend and something that should definitely sort of worry people who take anti-Semitism and Islamophobia seriously, that these two concerns might become polarized in that way. Um, there's also some age differences. So this is some research we did last year, but as you can see, the age profile of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is quite different. So generally, people are more likely to say we have negative views of Muslims than of Jews across every age group, actually. But it tends to be older people who are more negative towards Muslims, and actually it's younger people who are more negative towards Jews. So you get sort of the opposite age profiles, which I think is notable and sort of particularly seemed relevant when we were doing our focus groups with sort of young Jewish university students who would say they'd noticed that as well. Okay, then we did a lot of research about how people talk about the conflict. So not just sort of how the conflict is changing people's perceptions of each other, but what language gets used, what sort of is seen as appropriate forms of protest, what they'd like to see musical artists doing about the conflict. The main thing to say is that most people feel uncomfortable talking about the conflict. So you can see people who sympathize with the Israeli and the Palestinian side tend to be much more comfortable talking about the conflict, both with friends and family and on social media. But people who don't take a side in the conflict are much more likely to say they feel uncomfortable talking about it. I think it's notable that people who take a side in the conflict make up 40% of the country, but they account for 71% of people who've posted about the conflict on social media. So those people are really overrepresented on social media, which I think sort of makes people who don't take a side feel like it's really hard to speak up because they don't want to basically be labeled or judged to believe something they don't really believe. And that was really clear when we sort of asked people in social media what made them feel uncomfortable speaking out. I think another thing really interestingly driving this is the perception gaps. So as I said earlier, as I said many times, most people don't take a side in the conflict. If you ask people who sympathize with Palestine what side, how they think the country falls out, they think half the country sympathize with Palestine. So they double in their head the amount of people who actually sympathize more with the Palestinian side. Similarly, people on the Israeli side think that people are much more likely to sympathize with Israel, and they actually do the same. They double. I think there's twice as many pro-Israel people as there actually are. You could see this perhaps as being evidence that people are being sort of filtered into echo chambers on social media, where they think many more people share their views than actually do. And I think a big consequence of this is that if you think many more people are behind you than there actually are, then you go for a sort of a rallying the base strategy rather than a persuasion strategy. So if people who sympathize more with Palestine, for example, knew that only a quarter of the country shared their views, more of their language and campaigning tactics might be much more around how do you persuade these people in the middle to sort of gently approach your view. Whereas if you think half the country share your view, you're just going to be shouting more about the conflict and sort of trying to rally the base. It's the same on both sides. Um, knowing how big those people who don't pick a side and how big a group that is, I think would probably change some of the strategies that have been used by campaigners talking about the conflict. Um, One thing we've looked at in this report is the language that sort of people on either side of the conflict use. So I've chosen two examples here, but basically we found that when people on one side use very emotive language, it sometimes sort of doesn't mean the same thing that, or it's not landing with people on the other side in the way they think it is. So one example is Zionists. Um, if you look at Zionism in the UK, 22% of Britons have a negative view of Zionists, and that's 55% of progressive activists say they have a negative view of Zionists. That's this chart on the left. If you just replace that with people who support the right of Jewish people to have a nation in Israel, just 9% of people have a negative view of that group. Actually, people are much more likely to say have a positive view of that group. Um, so clearly, something about the word Zionists is sort of has more negative connotations then sort of you replace it with a simpler or clearer language. And it's clear that sort of there's something being lost in translation, basically, when you use those two words. We wrote a lot in the report about sort of the language of genocide as well. I encourage you to read that. We've done sort of similar experiments. But the top line really is that less than 4 in 10 of the country think that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide, and it's just progressive activists where a majority think that. We also asked in the report whether it's an appropriate word to use, and the people who don't take a side are much more uncomfortable with using that language. And I think it sort of shows that sort of, I guess, regardless of what people believe is happening, it's not necessarily going to be a way that sort of reaches across to the other side and helps make a point. In fact, it might sort of immediately sort of signal to the other side that you're not entering the conversation with like shared starting points, which can sort of shut down conversation in some cases. Um, we've discussed at length already, so I won't spend too long on this, but the majority of people think that social media is seen as unhelpful for all of those reasons I've just discussed. And people really are sort of worried by what they see on social media and think that extreme views are crowding out everyone else basically on social media. Um, I'll talk briefly about protest and then I want to leave enough time for questions. Going into this project, I wasn't expecting protest to be such a sort of a big topic of discussion. But in almost every focus group, when I asked people how the conflict had shaped Britain, particularly with these disengaged and socially conservative segments, but really actually with more people than you'd expect. The number one thing people thought of was pro-Palestine protests on the streets, basically. Um, and I think this is sort of wound up in a load of other big protests that have been happening in recent years. So obviously Just Stop Oil is the other one that people think of, but also the Unite the Kingdom rallies that have been happening. It's pretty clear that Britain never used to have these sort of American style debates about free speech and free protest, but some people are beginning to think that basically disruptive protests shouldn't be allowed. Actually, 2/3 of the country say that some of these protests shouldn't be allowed because they're so disruptive, and there's only progressive activists who really clearly overwhelmingly support them. So I think it's interesting there that these protests have really sort of shaped people's tolerance for disruption. And I should say it's really the disruption thing that worries people. It's not what they're saying. We've asked a similar question to this, basically saying, is some language so harmful that it shouldn't be allowed? And people think, no, all language should be allowed, even if it's not harmful. It's the disruption that people don't like. Um, On the free speech thing, yeah, I mentioned earlier that sort of the debates about free speech have been creeping into the discourse in Britain, I think, as a result of a lot of these protests. Again, it also ties into the Unite the Kingdom rallies that have happened. If you just look at the top line on each of these charts, that's what the UK public think. Basically, the UK public tend to think that people are free to protest all these things. People are free to protest that immigration should be reduced. People are free to protest against the Labour government. People think people are free to protest in favour of Israel and free to pray in protest of Palestine. The challenge is that people who actually hold those views think they're not free to do that. So everyone sort of thinks that other people have free speech, but they don't themselves. And that came up quite a lot in focus groups when people sort of suggested, in some cases, some quite radical restrictions on protests. I would say, isn't that against free speech? And a lot of people have quite nihilistic views towards free speech at the moment. They'll say, yeah, but no one has free speech anymore. You can't say anything. And it's clear that sort of people do feel like their views aren't free to be heard, or plenty of people feel that. There's a long section in the report about cultural figures, and obviously we had most famously, I think, Bob Dylan saying death to the IDF. Clear majority of the public say they wouldn't like it if an artist did that, but I think this is a case that's much broader than Gaza, but not really related to Gaza at all. People don't want cultural politicians sort of like inciting violence, basically. So they don't want a politician to, they don't want a musical artist to say the only good politician is a dead politician, for example. Um, People are much more likely to be fine with a musical artist saying, I stand with Ukraine or end the war in Gaza or free Palestine, even. Although even then, people are more likely to say they wouldn't like it than would. But there's some interesting charts in the report where we compare the war in Gaza with the war in Ukraine. And in both cases, basically, apart from progressive activists, people tend not to want musical artists bringing them up. And when we ask them focus groups, it's because they go to gigs basically for entertainment and to relax and to switch off, and they don't necessarily want those things to come up at those gigs. Um, we looked a little bit at trust in the media in the report. I think what's really worrying basically is that as the conflict has gone on, people from either side have tended to trust mainstream media less and have been pushed towards their own news sources that sort of align more of their views. So BBC, for example, is a clear example of this, particularly among people who sympathize more with Israel. They really think it's been biased towards the Palestinian side. And I think scandals like the documentary How to Survive a War Zone really didn't help this. Actually, people on the Israeli side are more likely to say that BBC is biased towards Palestine than they say the same about Al Jazeera. So it's really pronounced there. You get less pronounced views on the Palestinian side, but you do get people tending to say that these media outlets are biased against them. And again, the issue here is that if people sort of drift towards their own news outlets, then it becomes much harder for the two sides to have a conversation on the basis of shared facts if they're getting their information from completely different sources. Yeah, here you can see trust in the BBC particularly collapsing. Actually, trust in the BBC has improved among people who sympathise more with Palestine throughout the course of the conflict, but it's got worse among sort of pro-Israel people. They tend to think the BBC is more biased than it was 2 years ago. Trust in politicians. It's clear that people, particularly Muslims and Jews, don't feel like politicians have represented their communities well at all in this conflict. I think it's really visible among British Muslims because there's enough places in the country where the Muslim electorate essentially is large enough to elect candidates who are very clearly seeking to better meet their demands. But among the Jews as well that we spoke to, it was really clear they didn't think the government has responded. I think one thing that's interesting with the Muslim community is that even though they're really pissed off about Gaza and they really don't think either the Labour or the previous Conservative government has done enough on it, their views are broader than that. And when you talk to them about why they're voting for these independent candidates, normally Gaza is not the first or second thing on their list. It's normally they feel like they've been overlooked by Labour politicians. Many of them are in sort of historic Labour safe seats, and they think that Labour sort of taken their votes for granted when actually they're really concerned about crime in their local area, concerned about healthcare and the NHS. They think the high street's gone rubbish. And they think sort of Gaza, in many cases, we've often compared it to the Brexit vote, and that it's sort of been the trigger that has made people realize or made people think that, like, actually, my votes have been neglected for so long. I'm going to stand up to this party who historically I might have voted for. And it's really sort of disconnected people from those voting patterns and sort of led to this much wider revolt, I would say, against Labour. So conclusions. This is a slightly convoluted infographic, but I think it sums up the main takeaways of the report quite nicely. So if you look at the top, you've got the the two groups on either side who are a minority of the country, increasingly using different news sources and facts about the conflict, increasingly using different language to describe the conflict, and increasingly assuming that people come to their views in bad faith. That basically makes it much harder for the two sides to have conversations. It makes it much harder. It makes both sides think worse of each other, and it means debates about the conflict become much more heated. So those two sides are pulling apart. As a result, the majority of the country who don't take a side in the conflict are very worried about saying the wrong thing. They think people are going to think worse of them for speaking up. They've noticed that conversations about conflict are more heated and maybe less enjoyable, and they find it hard to know what's true. So those groups are switching off, and you get this dynamic that sort of repeats as those two sides pull apart and both sides switch off. And I should say this is not sort of unique to the Gaza conflict. When issues become more polarized, this is what happens. And it's if you've read our report about, for example, the debates about transgender and gender identity, you'll see that we see similar patterns. Obviously, not exactly the same, but people with strong views harden in their views, and then everyone else finds it much harder to sort of form their own opinion about it. We've got a load of recommendations in the report. I won't spend too much time on them today, but if anyone's read the report and has questions about them, feel free to ask. And that is that. I will stop sharing. And I'm also going to stop the recording so that sort of people can ask questions freely.